Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session at COP26 from Glasgow on race, labor, and climate justice, emerging frontline struggles for a just transition. My name is Adrienne Salazar, and I'm with the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, an alliance of about 70 grassroots organizations from across the United States and its territories. We're here with the It Takes Roots delegation at COP and have come together with about 60 people from the front lines of climate crisis and pollution all across the world to tell our leaders here at the UNFCCC negotiations that we demand real solutions to the climate crisis that don't leave any communities behind. I'm really excited today to have this discussion with our panelists to talk about the intersections of climate justice, racial justice, and economic justice. We know that the climate justice crisis is not just a crisis that is about biophysical science. The climate crisis is an inequitable crisis that is the result of centuries of colonialism and imperialism and extractive industry pillaging communities of color, Black, Indigenous communities, and continuing to pollute those communities with carbon emissions. We know today that frontline communities across the world that are Black, Indigenous, people of color communities suffer the most from environmental harms, from pollution that produces negative, harmful health impacts in our bodies, and that we are also experiencing simultaneously the impacts of climate crisis the worst. And this is true across the globe, where the global south and poorer nations are suffering the worst of climate crisis but have contributed the least, and within the United States, from where most of our panelists are today, which also has frontline communities that are affected most severely by climate disasters like heat waves, flooding, superstorms, and the chronic injustice and crisis of pollution and racial inequality. So I'm very excited for us to have this discussion today, and I will say that I myself, as a Filipino American who was born in the Philippines and migrated to the United States, am a product of imperialism because the Philippines was a former US colony, and there is a tight economic and political arrangement that has persisted between our countries. And at the same time, the Philippines is one of the world's most climate vulnerable countries. And so when I think about my own experiences of my family in the Philippines and in the United States, who are living with typhoons and wildfires, who have to plan every year for whether or not they're going to face a disaster, whether or not their children can go outside. This is a palpable crisis for us. It is not abstract. It is not in 2050. It is not about projecting into the future what we can do. It is about what must be done right now for us to be able to survive. And more than that, for us to be able to transition into communities that leave nobody behind, that are regenerative, and for where we can all thrive. And so I'm very excited to hear from our panelists today their work around this issue, around how do we transition from that extractive and harmful economies that have produced the climate crisis to an economy that is renewable and regenerative. What is the specific program that workers are putting in place to transition industries away from fossil fuels? What are the ways that communities are building regenerative solutions on the ground? So today, with me to discuss this are Lisa Hamilton, the author of our Black Labor Initiative Just Transition Report, Peyton Wilkins from the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists Education Center, Daryl Jordan from East Michigan Environmental Action Center, who I know as Babauta, and Sheila Babauta from the Micronesia Climate Change Alliance. And I will allow them to introduce themselves in further detail. And we'll start the panel by turning first to Peyton. And I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, a little bit about your work, and to try to weave in this first question, which is how do you experience in your community racialized climate crisis? And what does climate injustice mean to you in your work? Peyton?
Well, thank you for the introduction, Adrian. I appreciate that. So my name is Peyton Wilkins, originally from Detroit, Michigan. I run the Education Center for the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and I do a lot of work with the Deep South Center of Environmental Justice, actually a program manager of the Environmental Careers and Workforce Development Program. When I think about how the climate crisis impacts us at home, at work, and in the community, there are so many different ways that this expresses itself. I often think about the depoliticization of vulnerable populations following natural disasters. A great textbook example of that will be what happened after Hurricane Katrina, when after the black teachers returned to the city of New Orleans, they fired all of the teachers and created a federalized system of charter schools. Well, the Black Teachers Union was one of the strongest political forces in the city, and New Orleans got its first white mayor after that, right? Often think about how climate disasters and climate crisis creates a greater health and wealth disparity, access to health care, the exacerbation of health, in particular upper respiratory illnesses, and we look at how the intersection of climate change and COVID-19 impacted our communities this year, and how pollution impacts that. But we also look at the climate crisis impacting us in ways where we have implied poverty taxes, where they create these ideas of creating taxes on petrol while subsidizing the purchases of electric vehicles, right? That's an implied poverty tax. If you can't afford to buy an electric vehicle, then you must pay the tax on gas. But also thinking about how this expresses itself in these industries that are dying and dwindling, and individuals are losing pensions, and or even as we talk about like the city of Detroit, I'm sure Babauta will go more into it, and we've already seen the transition of economic and industries. When the car manufacturing industry began to dwindle, they just up and left. And forgive me, I often speak in colloquialisms. I hope that translates well. And they didn't clean up the neighborhoods that they were in, right? And they just kind of left us there with brownfields. And several, probably 1 or 2 decades ago, the EPA began to count all of the brownfields in the city of Detroit, and they stopped counting at 60,000 and decided to deem the whole city a Superfund, right? So when we think about what is just transition and how these climate crisis impacts us, it's not as clear cut as just retraining individuals and making sure that people have new jobs, but it's also about this other aspect. And Jose, who just walked in, will speak to this about how just transition, this movement that came out of the environmental justice movement, started with this question of, all right, let's clean up our communities that these industries have left. But also understanding that we can't double down on these technocratic and market-based strategies as a solution to get us out of this climate crisis. And I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to kind of talk about how doubling down on these ideas creates a double disaster for us, right? So I think those are some of the most explicit ways in my work where climate crisis reveals itself.
Thank you, Peyton. Lisa?
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you for having me on this panel. So my name is Lisa Ann Hamilton. I am an attorney and researcher, and was grateful enough to work with CBTU on doing a comprehensive just transition report. I've been involved with the NAACP's Black Labor Initiative on just transition for several years now. And what we really wanted to do was address the issues that Peyton just raised in terms of just transition is more than just looking at what does a new economy look like for workers. For Black and brown people of color, it's really about where we come to this discussion, coming at this discussion from years of environmental racism, environmental degradation, policies that have kept brown people excluded from opportunity, and how do we make sure that in constructing this new chapter in the economy that you bring everyone along, that no one is left behind. And so what we sat down and really tried to translate the kinds of experiences that Peyton just mentioned and really adopt several principles. How do we make sure that a just transition is inclusive? How do we make sure that we address not only opportunities for training and retraining, but also how do we make sure that unions, that places where many of our people are often excluded, have the opportunities to become fully participating in the new economy? How do we make sure there's certification so that if you are interested in participating in a clean energy economy and you want to be trained for or retrained for opportunities in the solar, wind, and clean energy economy, that those opportunities are available to you. And also, it's about the process. How do we make sure that communities of color are part of the decision-making process from the beginning? How do we make sure that there's access to information, that there's thorough community outreach, and that we're working intersectionally, meaning that you have healthcare workers, you have our teachers, you have all of our steel workers. We have everyone who is going to be impacted by this transition at the table from the beginning, not as an afterthought. And so in working in this report, we developed, sort of looked at the academic research, and then this past week and a half of talking all to the wonderful brothers and sisters who have embraced me from the labor movement. I'm so grateful to you all for sharing your stories and helping me understand this is about people and families and generations of families that have worked in mines and in plants, and that this new energy economy really needs to reflect what they need and their demands, and that it's not just a bureaucratic and administrative action that doesn't take those into consideration. So I look forward to talking more about these issues, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm really excited about all of the ideas that you've shared, Peyton and Lisa, and thinking about how does a transition actually include people's voices and material needs, because when we talk about transitioning off of fossil fuels, we're talking about people's livelihoods, and we don't want those communities to be left behind either. I'm excited to dive into that discussion, but we want to hear from our other panelists. So Babauta, you want to share a little bit about yourself and what environmental racism looks like in your community?
Yes, thanks, Adrian. I'm really glad to be here. I'm sitting with panelists who I've worked with and I really admire, but I've been an organizer since 1978. I wanted to put that out there first, because sometimes people think that when we start talking about climate change and environmental justice, we need to be just talking about clean air, healthy water, and how people have treated the land. But I want folks to understand that I come from the city of Detroit, one of the blackest cities in the United States. And I want you to know that in some ways they treat Detroit just like they treat every other third world and fourth world country around the world. I mean, we're about 80% black, and when you add the rest of the population, you start adding in the Spanish-speaking community, the Arab community, a small Asian community, and a few indigenous people too. And plus, we have some Europeans. Usually they are old and they're retired, and many of them have worked in some of the automobile industries and some of the other plants. And oftentimes when we think of communities of color, especially the black community, and folks who are on islands and in areas where they've been for a while, we think about survival. And so I wanted to say that first, because our people have been working on these issues forever. It didn't just start about 30 years ago and stuff when folks wanted to start using the word environment. You know, from the time the Europeans came to the United States and began to do genocide against our indigenous people, and then after a while decided they needed some free labor, so then they jumped in the boat, went to Africa and brought back African folks, carried them to Virginia. For those people who are not in the United States, y'all might be thinking about some things, but in the United States, they just had an election in Virginia, and folks are all concerned because all of a sudden the Republicans just won Virginia. One of the big issues was critical race theory, which is something that Lisa would be talking about in a law school or something. But you know, that's not what they teach in schools, but folks get all upset because they say communities get all upset when we start talking about racism, genocide, and so forth. But we got to talk about that because we're not just talking about history. I just want to say that right now. I'm not going to sit here and just talk about history. We're talking about last week, last year, and week before last in Detroit. We have these corporations that still try to take advantage of us. We have Chrysler, who has a new name. What is it now? Stellantis? And so when they come with a name like that, folks in the city and folks in the community think, oh, we have a new corporation name. They are full of new ethics and they're doing good. Well, in the last month, the factory has been putting out something in the air that has really been affecting the community, especially old people that look like me and young folks like in toddler age and a little over. And we got to do something about that. We live in a world where it's not just a natural kind of thing. Racism is very much a part of what we're dealing with. Some of you all around the world have heard about the Flint crisis. And y'all be saying, oh my God, what kind of natural kind of thing happened there? It wasn't natural. It was very much racist as heck. Y'all thought I was going to say something else. But let me tell you, what happened was that in the state of Michigan, the Democrats created something called emergency management, which means that they can put somebody in control of your city, and then your city council, your school board, your mayor, the folks you elect that have no power. And so while it was created by the Democrats, the Republicans had 2 black folks, because some of us, we might come from communities that have been impacted, but some of the folks who look just like me act just like the other folks who want to take advantage and use our communities. And so we had 2 emergency managers, one in Detroit and one in Flint. And the one in Flint wanted a good deal on the water because Detroit, the city of Detroit owns the water system. And Detroit emergency manager wouldn't give him a deal. And so he decided to use the Flint River. If that man had just picked up his telephone and just Googled Flint River, he would have found out that General Motors stopped using the Flint River because it was corroding the auto parts. Now, people kept drinking the water because nobody told them that there was a problem. Next thing you know, in a few months, a year or so, then all of a sudden people from Flint were coming to Detroit to meetings that we were having with the Detroit People's Water Board. They would bring big jars of water that looked really nasty, you know, and they were saying, this is coming out of our faucet, you know, and then they could pull off their hat or their wig and you see their hair was falling out. There were people that died and got sick. But you know, nobody has gone to jail for that. If you're wondering why I wanted to tell that story, because nobody has gone to jail. No corporation has really been held responsible. And the state of Michigan continues to go on. Not just that Flint was the only one. Now we're dealing with Benton Harbor, which has a same issue with water. And Detroit, everybody wants to pretend that, oh, the pandemic came, we all have to be healthy. And so all of a sudden, nobody was thinking about that. In Detroit, we had thousands of people whose water has been shut off. And so now, all the way through the pandemic, we still got people who don't have water. And I got a whole lot of other stuff to tell you that you might not be thinking about. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to continuing to talk about the impact on the city of Detroit.
Thank you, Babauta, for really painting a picture of what communities in Detroit and Flint are experiencing when we talk about water crisis, when we talk about pollution. And I think this is what we're trying to bring to the COP, is the experiences of people who are on the front lines, what they call on the fence lines of what have been deemed sacrifice zones, because our continued extractive economy, our dependence on fossil fuels, means that some communities must be the sites of their disposal and of their extraction. And those are communities that are left behind, marginalized, and sacrificed. And so we've heard from Detroit. Now we want to hear all the way from the other side of the world, Micronesia. Sheila, can you tell us a little bit about what your experiences are of the extractive economy?
Thank you, Adrian. Hafade Tiro, Kasalalia Menko. My name is Sheila Jack Babauta. I am from the Mariana Islands, born and raised on an island called Saipan, next to the Marianas Trench, the deepest point in our world's ocean. I am the daughter of Diego Regis Babauta and Dolorina Wilbacker Jack Babauta. And I am here today as a climate justice weaver with the Micronesia Climate Change Alliance. I also serve on the 22nd CNMI House of Representatives in our legislature. I am the chairwoman of the Friends of the Marianas Trench Marine National Monument, and I serve on the board of Our Commonwealth 670, where we aim to educate our community about militarization in the Mariana Islands. So many people around the world do not know how tied our community has been to the United States military. For over 500 years, we've been colonized by many different administrations, beginning with the Spanish, then the Germans, the Japanese, and now the Americans. We are one of 5 US territories, and we have a long history with militarism in my community. So in my community, what environmental injustices look like are really poisonous. It's just completely poisonous. Throughout the 14 islands that we have, the US military has conducted destructive, toxic military training, all in the name of national security. And so here we are all the way in the Pacific where nobody can even point us out on a map. Yet we are a sacrifice zone, just like Adrienne pointed out. So a lot of my work has been around raising awareness because of this long history of colonialism in my community. People are not even aware that we're a sacrifice zone. And so we have this level of patriotism that we feel the need to sacrifice ourselves and our families and our future generations for national security. And that is a very sensitive topic to talk about in my community because we have the highest per capita of enlisted servicemen and women. We have fought and died in US wars. My uncle, Jeff Darrence Wilbacker Jack, he died in the Iraqi war, and he wasn't even an American citizen. They granted him American citizenship after he died. At his funeral, they gave that certificate to his wife, just in case she needed US citizenship. And so stories like that exist in our community, yet nobody talks about how that is an injustice. Everyone is proud to be a part of this American family because of the resources that we're given, right? Especially come now, we have the pandemic where it collapsed, totally collapsed our economy because we are 100% dependent on tourism. So here we are, a tourist destination, and we market ourselves as a tourist destination. Come see our beautiful beaches because it is a beautiful place on the earth, largely untouched, largely undiscovered next to the Marianas Trench. Yet at the same time, we are welcoming the US military to come in and destroy our natural resources. How is that going to even work with tourism? So I have plenty of things to share about the United States military in our community, but one thing that I really want to point out is that they do not conduct any kind of training or experiments with chemicals in Beverly Hills, right? This happens where it's so far out into the ocean where the people are brown and they maybe live in huts and wear coconut grass skirts. And we want national security, we want to feel safe, but we don't want to pay the price of testing the chemicals or storing all of the tanks, the mortars, the bombs, torpedoes. We don't want to store any of that in our community, but we want to feel safe. So, you know, this really does encompass a huge, complex conversation that nobody is really having because of patriotism, and because of loyalty, and because of the American family and that dream that national security is the only way for us to feel safe, and that's through militarism. So, you know, I look forward to sharing more about this topic on this panel because it does impact our work, our labor, and it is related to race and our health. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sheila. And I'm really glad that you brought up the role of the military. And for folks watching online and who will maybe watch this later on the recording, you may not know that the US military is the #1 single emitter of carbon emissions and other pollutants in the world. The #1. And yet we're here at COP26 in Glasgow, and military pollution is exempt, is excluded from the international agreements that are being negotiated. And it has been exempt since the Kyoto Protocol. So the massive amounts of emissions coming into communities like Sheila's and around the world where there are militarized operations and wars are not even part of these discussions.
Right.
And we want to talk about that. But I have here my friend and mentor, Jose Bravo. I didn't get to introduce in the beginning because we're here live in Glasgow and people are coming and going from different sessions, right? But we're really excited to have Jose Bravo from the Just Transition Alliance here and joining us in our conversation about race, labor, and climate justice. And I wonder, Jose, if you could share a little bit about what the work, the historic work of the Just Transition Alliance has been in talking about the impacts in communities like Detroit and in Micronesia and trying to transition out of those extractive economies.
So thank you, Adrian, for that introduction. I'm honored to be here on this panel, and I'm here to talk about the R word, and that's resistance. Our communities have been resisting for over 500 years, different systems of exploitation. And as you've heard people talk about in this panel, you start to get an idea of just what we've been up against. I think it's super important for people to understand that in the United States, if we're talking about a global structure, there is a South within the North in regards to a global structure. Communities of color, low-income communities in the United States, for most of the time, these structures like Red Plus that the UN pushes and other carbon trading structures are first tried in our communities in the United States, and then those structures are taken out globally for exploitation purposes. I also want to make sure that people understand that if you took a map of the United States and you put where the highest densities of people of color and low-income communities are, and at the same time you overlaid another map where the dirtiest industries, the most toxics are spilled, stored, or there's waste dumps, toxic waste dumps, they mirror almost identical. So that's planned. That's what we call environmental racism. So we need to understand that moving forward, there is more than a carbon debt to communities of color in the United States. There is a legacy of racism and contamination, and to Sheila's community as well. So there is that piece. The other piece that I wanted to mention is, I was reading a draft agreement that might come out of here, and they were talking about taking away subsidies from the petrochemical industry. Subsidies that need to be redirected, actually, to our communities because of the legacy of dirty energy and what it's leaving behind. So it's important for us to make sure that those subsidies, in many ways, that's our money that's been going to corporations to do just what we've been talking about. That needs to be redirected. And lastly, I'll just point out that there's this new phenomena around the globe, and this new phenomena is called disaster capitalism. It was first very apparent to us after Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf Coast. Because what happened was that after that hurricane, people moved away, out, were evacuated. We could go into that process of evacuation, but let's just say people left. And lo and behold, privatizing of education, privatizing of energy, privatizing of water, privatizing of most every other thing that people needed on a daily basis. After Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, the same thing happened. So they're using these climate change driven catastrophes to literally privatize our infrastructure in the sense of charging us more for electricity, charging us more for water, education, other things of that nature. And it's shameful because the United States is probably the leader in this process, and we call them to the floor around those issues. And I'm also very disturbed at the fact that our president, President Biden, came here and made several commitments to this United Nations conference, but at the same time was opening up public lands and public lands, primarily in the Gulf Coast, to more oil exploration and gas exploration. That's a two-faced approach. You can't come here and make declarations and then go back to the country and do the opposite. So ultimately, again, thank you very, very much. This is about our communities and our workers that are at the fence line and at the front line of exposure.
Thank you, Jose. And we've heard so many interesting experiences of people and workers here already. There's so much that we could dig into, from militarization to pollution in frontline communities. And I think what we're doing here is weaving a tapestry, right, of what our experiences are on the front lines of this climate crisis at all ends of the spectrum, from the production of fossil fuels to emissions to disposal of wastes. And I want to invite a discussion now and come back to the idea of racial justice and how all of these issues touch on race. And for all of us who are from the United States or grew up in the United States and the territories, racism is alive and present. We only need to know look at our last president and the ongoing issues we have with our elections and the gerrymandering in our country around people of color communities being excluded from access to the vote, to see how real and present that is. But here at the climate conference, we want to talk about how climate justice requires racial justice, right? And some people might be like, what? How does that relate? And so I want to hear from the panelists and whoever wants to dive into this question first. You know, what does it mean to say that climate justice is racial justice, and what does that look like for your community and the people, the workers that you work with? And I invite people who are watching to, if you hear something exciting that you want to share out on Twitter or Facebook, use that hashtag climate justice is racial justice. So anybody want to tackle that question first?
I'll jump out there. All right, I'll jump out, and I see Jose looking at me as if to say, what are you going to say now? Well, I want to say this real quick, that we live in a country that oftentimes the community doesn't fully understand what's going on. I'm really glad to be here at the UN COP conference because there's so much I learned from all these folks who understand the science of climate change and the science of environmental, but we've got to help our folks understand this is an issue that's really about power. And the power right now is coming from our governments and from these corporations and these very rich folks who are getting their way and making a whole lot of money. And, you know, and I was the person who used to tell people, say, well, you know, climate change isn't really about race, you know, because we're going to all die if we don't take care of the earth and keep it alive. And we've got folks who act like this is a racial issue and that they can kill off the people in the communities we live in and they're going to be all right. But if you don't save the earth and take care of it, we all going to suffer. But I want to say we've got to do this education in a way that people in our communities understand what's going on. We have too many politicians who can talk a good game, but they're not doing anything. Jose just mentioned President Biden coming over here, making it seem like he's all about great climate change and working on environmental issues, at the same time that he's further making land available for more exploitation, you know? And so we've got to do something. It's time for us to go into the communities and begin to talk to people in a way that they understand it. You know, just think about this. You might be in a country that speaks a language that you don't speak, and you have no idea what's going on. And in the struggle in the United States right now about environmental justice and climate change, we need to do another level of translation so that the people in the neighborhoods really know what's going on, and we can bring them together so that we can get them to come together to vote to get rid of the folks who don't want to do nothing except make money, and put in people who are concerned about their children, their grandchildren, the communities and the land that we live on. Now, how we need to do that? We've got to break it down. There's no need to go into the community using words that are over people's heads. I often tell this joke, and so I hope I get away with it. But you know, it's as if there's a party going on. You can figure that we all having a party, and they say, Daryl, what do you want to talk about? And I say, I think I want to talk about calculus. You know, if we were in a room full of folks, a third of the people might leave because, you know, they don't want to talk about calculus. That might be a little too difficult for them. And then you got another group of people who are going to turn you off because you're talking about something they don't know anything about. And then you got another third of people who will sit there and act like they know what's going on, but they don't. But we've got to be able to talk to them in words that they understand so that they understand that corporations putting stuff in the air that can make it hard for you to breathe, that might be what's happening now, but it also sometimes causes cancer and harder and more difficult health diseases. And we got to talk about what happens with the water in a way that people understand, because sometimes when we let people think that there's nothing they can do, they don't do anything. And so we've got to talk to them in a way that they understand that they need to come together, stand up, and fight back. And we need to do that in a way that we can come together and not let folks divide us, making us think that, oh, only Sheila's community is dealing with that. Oh, no, Sheila's community is dealing with that, my community is dealing with that, and communities all over the world. And so we need to talk in ways that folks know what we're talking about so that we can make some real change and survive.
Yes.
You know, I think as we unpack this idea of what climate justice and its relationship to racial justice is, we have to really unpack what is justice, right? Who deserves justice? Why do we deserve justice, right? And as we answer those questions, we can really develop the call for climate justice being a form of racial justice, right? So I felt myself beginning to ramble here. Baba Daryl just really tore it up for us. So,
I think you're totally right, Peyton. And one of the things I think, Baba Daryl, you're trying to say is that people on the ground, the folks that are our neighbors, our friends, our family, our aunties, our uncles, we need to be able to hear what they're experiencing in their voices. And the words that are being used in these spaces are not the words that resonate with people. And so, Peyton, Lisa, I know you've done a lot of work with folks who are workers, Black folks, trying to tease out what a transition in their communities looks like. And can you say a little bit more about what that vision is and what have people said to you when you've had these conversations about just transition?
Sure.
Please.
So I want to echo and amplify everything that's been said, because I completely agree with you, Baba Daryl, that so much of climate science was about the technical measuring of highly nuanced atmospheric data that has no relevancy to people who are on the front line and the fence line of the struggle. So when you unpack what do climate impacts look like? It means that people can be without electricity for days, and so their medications aren't cold enough, and that they can't feed their children, and that food is spoiling, and the amount of dollars of trying to figure out if you couldn't evacuate, what are your options? It's really about human suffering and really being able to say, how do we prepare in a way that avoids as much human suffering as possible. And as storms become more intense and more frequent, we know that there's planning involved and that we're not all coming to the crisis at the same level. And so how do you say, regardless of your income level, your job status, your health, the age, thinking about elderly people in retired living facilities who who don't have the flexibility or ability or mobility to just simply avoid a storm. How do we create policies and recommendations that include everyone? That is what an equitable, just transition looks like, and that's what climate justice looks like, that no one gets left behind, that no one, regardless of your income, knowing that you will be attended to, taken care of, and supported. We know this is happening, and we have the opportunity now to plan. Exactly the same thing with workers. We have workers who are the foundation of this country, of the United States, and who have worked in refining industries, have worked in the chemical industry, who have made it possible for us to enjoy so many benefits of our society. If we know that those facilities are going to close and that those jobs are going to go away, those families should not bear the burden because it is of no fault of their own. They have done nothing but keep a roof over their heads and provided for their children. So we know that they are in the crosshairs. How do we plan and provide for them and make sure your income will be supported through this transition? You will have access to health care. We will help you keep a roof over your head. We know these things are coming. And to Jose's point about subsidies, we must get away from this notion that there's not enough money when it comes to the interests of families. There's this IMF report that came out in October of 2021, $11 million per minute on fossil fuel subsidies. $11 million. There's no excuse why we can't take care of workers and families. There just isn't. So if we adopt policies with that frame in mind, we can start building a just transition. We can ensure that we are avoiding the worst effects of human suffering due to climate change.
Beautifully said.
And I would just add that the reason why racial justice is, or climate justice is racial justice, is because this idea of climate justice and environmental justice are part of these larger movements, right? We talk about capital C, capital J, and I'm quoting Dr. Robert Bullard here, that the climate justice movement is a part of a justice movement, right, that extends from civil rights and the fight for human rights, right? But also understanding that this fight for justice includes much more than just saying like, yo, we need to make sure that the communities are clean, that pollution is being taken care of, but also addressing these systematic and systemic issues of white supremacy and how that expresses itself in our communities in the context of climate justice and environmental justice.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a little bit more about that, Pam? Because I feel like, you know, you brought out the big words here, white supremacy, and people watching online might be like, well, I'm on a panel at the COP. They're talking about white supremacy. What's going on? So can you say what did you mean when you say that we have to address white supremacy when we're talking about a transition from our communities away from fossil fuels?
Well, these issues are, like I said, much deeper than just creating subsidies for low wealth individuals, right? But really understanding how this inequality was created and what created it, and really what forms, both political economic forms that still sustain these systems of white supremacy, and how that is in relation to our everyday lives. So I know I just kind of set off a bomb with 32 minutes left in this panel, and I hope I don't get us kicked off for next year, right? But you know, I think in a lot of ways it's about us each defining for ourselves how does that express itself in our day-to-day lives, right? Not just for people of color who are impacted by white supremacy, but white people who are also impacted by white supremacy, right? And not really understanding that their liberation is tied to ours.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think, you know, when you look at a lot of the history of the environmental movement in the United States, there is an actual overlap with white nationalism in its early stages, in early conservationism, right? That there was this vision that they were going to push out people, indigenous people, from lands to protect them for the consumption of white people, of the white elite class. And And that persists into the ways that national environmental organizations across the United States are majority white in their membership and in their leadership. And then you come here to a place like COP, and we're talking about this COP after we're still going through the COVID-19 pandemic and the massive inequity of people's access from the global south, from black and brown countries. And so I am glad that you brought up white supremacy, because even if we don't name it, it's already in the room.
Yeah.
I want to take it a little bit further really quickly, and I was just looking at my cell phone. So I got this email from the White House, and they're calling me a stakeholder. Here it is, right, for people to see. And as a stakeholder, we've been having conversations with the White House about what the right thing to do is, right? But here comes a primarily white organization like WWF or the Nature Conservancy or somebody else, and the ideas go that way, right? That is part of white supremacy as well. So it's really, really important to understand that when we meet with the administrations and we have these conversations, they have to start taking our movement serious and not only go for what white people feel should be the fix in our neighborhoods, right? That's white supremacy. Yeah. And that's the process of actually maintaining white supremacy if there's no change, right?
Yeah, thank you, Jose.
Can I just add to that? So to me, in my islands, white supremacy looks like zero representation in the United States Congress. So we are a U.S. territory, and we don't even get to vote for president. But the president of the United States makes all the decisions that impact us. So we don't have representation in the United States Congress. We have a delegate who is pretty much a professional lobbyist, right?
Yep.
Yes.
He doesn't get to vote on the floor. And we don't go directly to the White House. We work through the Department of the Interior.
That's right.
And all these barriers are created just for us to have our voices heard. And by the time we get there, now we're at the table where you're at, right? So we're not even a stakeholder. I didn't get that email, right? And so that's what white supremacy looks like in my community. There's so much work to do just for us to come meet you all. And you're already fighting a really big fight to even move forward. So that's the voice of the Pacific Islands that I really want to bring to this table, and especially of the 5 colonized, communities that the United States is still hanging on to. And
Which territories are those?
And so the 5 U.S. territories are Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, who are not even considered United States citizens. They're considered United nationals, U.S. nationals. And then we have Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. Now, it's important to note that Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands are part of the same island chain.
Exactly.
It's like taking away the big island of Hawaii and saying, you're a separate territory, and we're going to politically divide you from the rest of your brothers and sisters. So it really has felt like our older sister was kidnapped,
Yep.
and they've definitely done a great job turning us against each other.
Yeah.
So now there's always competition between Northern Marianas and Guam, and look what they're doing on Guam. Oh, we are fighting over funding. It's really toxic and poisonous. White supremacy is deeply embedded in our roots, and we need to get that out before we can even begin to heal.
So what I've learned, Adrian, is if you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. So ultimately, it's very important to get these voices out and for people to understand that these systems of exploitation, right, that have been honed over years are now being put out, right? And the lack of representation of people that are actually at the fence line of impact is atrocious. And that should change, and it needs to change. Because ultimately, there's more of us than there is of them.
Yep.
Thank you both, Sheila and Jose. I want to ask, I'm going to have another question, but I want to let the folks know who are watching online that we are also taking your questions. So if we have some time, we can take some questions from the audience and get them, our panelists, to discuss them. So think about, you know, some of the things that we're talking about. If you have questions, they will come to us and we can answer them. But thank you again both for really painting the harsh reality. And it is harsh, it is real, and it is painful for a lot of our communities that we are going through when we have these discussions about climate crisis, when we are here at the COP and our communities are getting negotiated out of these agreements. When the main framing of this COP is net zero emissions, right? And I think, you know, you see the advertisements about this, you see corporations making these commitments to achieve net zero emissions, but why are they committing to net zero? It's because net zero is a framework through carbon offsets and carbon market schemes that allows continued pollution. And because if we can get to 90% emissions reduction, we might still have that 10% that needs to be polluting somewhere. And that's why they use the words net zero. And we're here to say that that's not enough, that it is going to continue harming our communities. We are actually demanding real solutions and that address keeping fossil fuels in the ground.
Well, the quickest solution, in my eyes, is leave fossil fuels in the ground. You just said it, right? The commitment is the big issue here, about how they do it, when they do it, and who gets to do it first, right? I think it's also very important to take back the language of, you know, clean energy.
Yes.
Because here, there's a piece in the preamble to the Paris Accord that talks about just transition. And we've heard countries in the UN talking about a just transition in regards to clean energy being nuclear energy. For those that think that, I think it's time for you to visit the Navajo Nation so that you can see 15,000 uranium mines that were abandoned and left leaking uranium tailings. And you tell me what part of that is clean? Clean for who? Because the same indigenous communities in the United States, primarily, because that's our experience, are also being targeted to put these nuclear waste dumps at.
Yep.
So they get the full cycle of impact. Again, we got to be careful with this language. The ultimate false solution, like you said, is leave it in the ground.
And the question about language again. You know, we like to use the word green when we start talking about clean energy and all that kind of stuff. Green jobs, green everything, you know? And it's a lie. It's like a big commercial. They put something out there and start talking about green, so people think things are getting better. And so they kind of lay back and trust the people who are talking about that. Oftentimes it's corporations who aren't really green, and governments can be even worse. And, you know, one of my colleagues that I work with, he's Palestinian. And so while I know people have different opinions on the struggle of Palestinians, I want to talk about the Israeli army that says they're the greenest army in the world. And so if they're the greenest army in the world because they're feeding their soldiers vegan food, does that make them really green jobs, considering that they're killing people and destroying the land? So I want to just have people just think about that for a minute and think about it in regards to how we use these words, you know? And they're not the only ones. We have commercials in Detroit. We have an issue right now with Line 5. And Line 5 is a pipeline that wants to shoot oil through Michigan and stuff. But at the same time, if you happen to be up about 10:30, 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, looking at the late news, looking at the movies or something, for me, you know, I'm looking at Perry Mason starting at 11:30. But then they have this commercial that comes on about from Enbridge and DTE. And for somebody that's working with people around environmental issues, and working with people who are concerned about keeping the oil in the ground and stuff, I'm sitting there looking at the commercial, and I'm still smiling, because the way the commercial comes off to people is like that they're just doing great stuff. And so we've got to get to the point that we help people understand what's going on. Because if I'm sitting in the meetings and sitting in the workshops with people who are talking about these issues, and I'm still looking at the commercial and confused because it sounds like they're really good people, then we've really got a lot of good work to do.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do, Babauta, and I want to talk about that work. Since we're running out of time, I think we've laid out a lot of what these harmful extractive industries and governments are doing in our communities, and the kinds of ways that people need a transition that lifts everybody up, that leaves nobody behind. Can we talk a little bit more? I'd love to hear from folks, like, what is that positive vision of how a just transition should happen? What do your community members, your neighbors, the workers that you work with say they need? And what is some things that you're working on that you've piloted examples, or you know that your communities are building the regenerative economy now? Anybody want to start?
So I guess I'll start to talk about some of the work that Coalition of Black Trade Unionists have been doing with our Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. It oftentimes looks like creating a dialectic within this context of environmental justice and climate justice, so that we can create critical thinking and praxis around these ideas, and so that individuals can exercise their own self-determination when developing what does these solutions look like for us, right? So when we have these educational series, we really break down some of these ideas of universal basic incomes, right? We really break down these ideas of retraining individuals, and also really talking about how we're near a point where work should be a choice and not something that we all must do. And that looks like breaking down these false paradoxes where individuals have to choose between working for a polluting facility and living in a clean community, right? So those are some of the examples of the things that we do. Also working very closely with intelligent people like Lisa Hamilton here, and making sure that we capture their voices around here. You know, I'm not so naive to believe that we show up here and, you know, I can change the trajectory of negotiations. And really, we came here with the intentions of being able to bring more rank and file members to speak for themselves. That's right. But because of this capitalist system we live in, it was much too expensive for individuals to take off work, to pay thousands of dollars to stay in a hotel, and pay another $1,000 or so to fly here. Right? So it's really, our work is about making sure that we can create this echo chamber in which their voices are being heard here in spaces like this and other places.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful to CBTU for supporting this research and for allowing me the opportunity to sort of draw upon the projects that I've worked with in the past, where there are case studies and actual projects that have succeeded in terms of a facility closes. All of the expenses to fully close that facility, to remediate that site, remove all contamination, to bring together urban planners and investors to come in and say, how can we revitalize this community for something that's better, cleaner, regenerative, something that contributes something more back to the community, that cleans up the air, that cleans up the water, that allows for new jobs and new opportunities. And so there are examples of successes around the United States where, when the coordination of resources, capacity on the ground, can build these new models and these new opportunities that look nothing like the extractive. And when you talk about extractive, it's one thing to just talk about pulling the natural resources out of the earth, but you've pulled so much more than that. You've pulled away a sense of security from families and communities on the front line. You've pulled away so much of their agency and self-determination, because these companies rarely invest in the communities that they are operating in. You know, and you talk about the Navajo Nation. I had the privilege of visiting one community where for years Peabody coal extracted the coal, and they're taking water, draining the aquifers of those communities, so people had very little access to just water to wash their clothes or faces, to cook meals. To move towards an economy that's truly regenerative, that really looks at the entire investment. It's possible, and it can be done, and it just requires the kind of education that Bob Darrell's talking about, where telling people, being able to communicate with people about how to get involved, how to show up at those community meetings, how to start talking about what you want in your community, and to be a powerful voice that's too loud to be ignored. So it's possible that it can be done, and those coalitions are developing and forming. So I'm optimistic anyway that they can be. It will take persistence. There's some big giants in the room, but it can be done.
I want to mention something really quick. I think having been doing a little bit of just transition work in my life, I just want to mention that not every just transition is the same. There's no cookie cutter approach to a just transition. A just transition strategy and work develops from the bottom up. You know, and what we've always said is a just transition, if worker or work site wants to transition out of a job or out of a production or into something more sustainable, if it doesn't include the community, it's not a just transition. If community members are moving towards shutting down industries without having workers at the table, it's also not a just transition. And a just transition really takes an understanding of almost like a life cycle approach on things, right? So if we're moving into a just transition around the production of something, and there's either exploitation of workers, communities, people's health, people's incomes, other things like that, that's not a just transition. So a just transition primarily is looking at the life cycle of a process and including two things. One is not a production that takes you from cradle to grave, but takes you from cradle to cradle. And a just transition must include repurposing. Because if we don't include repurposing, we will always need to be extracting things, right? So it's super important for us to understand that. We were told early on by actually the person that came up with the concept, you know, that lived, not actually that was part of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. And by the way, Sheila, they made everything from a BB to a nuclear weapon.
Wow.
And 90,000 chemicals in between.
Wow.
So they said, look, as workers, we see the writing on the wall. Some of the things that we produce do not need to be on the face of this planet, right? But as workers, how are we going to transition out? We pushed back organizations and networks early on and said, wait, it's not only about workers, it's about the communities that have been living the legacy as well, right? So a super fund for workers, the idea of super funds for workers, of taxing everything that's bad to develop, you know, some kind of a fund to transition workers and to clean up communities. But now I think we're kind of shifting into this process, which why I mentioned early on in the draft agreement that it's these subsidies that have gone to these millionaires and billionaires that need to be redirected back to those communities and those workers for a just transition, because that's our money.
Right.
Yeah, it's like a divest and invest strategy.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, Sheila, if you can say a little bit about what it might look like for the Marianas, for Saipan, to have a just transition, for it to demilitarize. And if there are groups that you work with that are actually trying to do that now.
So as a climate justice weaver with the Micronesia Climate Change Alliance, we have prioritized creating a network in Micronesia. That is one of the first steps, right? Have a representative from each of the islands so that we can begin to weave this fabric and build understanding around the just transition framework. We don't talk about the just transition framework. We don't even talk about climate change enough in the islands. Everybody's just trying to survive. We've been trying to survive for over 500 years. And we now face unpredictable storms that have turned into super typhoons. So we've had super typhoon Sodalor, we've had super typhoon Yutu, and now we have COVID. Nobody is talking about climate change because we cannot even lift our heads up to see into the future. We're just trying to get our families settled and protected and safe. And so building this network, raising awareness, bringing the conversation to the table, just doing that is work. That's organizing, that's, you know, recruiting, that's going into the classrooms, that's getting the media involved. That's also trying to change this narrative, right? That colonialism has really poisoned for my people. And so transitioning out of the military. Then Sheila, what's the alternative? Because that's the question I get all the time. We have the military here bringing in the jobs. We have them building a base. We have, you know, contracts available, millions of dollars. What we don't talk about, though, is that the base is on Guam, and all the training and activities, that's going to happen in the rest of the islands where I live. So we're not even going to experience the jobs. We're not even going to experience the boom in business because that's going to happen on a different island. So these are the things that people tend to, I guess, forget when we're thinking of, you know, building a base in an island chain, right? We don't just drive over to Guam. You get on a plane and some people have never even been to Guam. Some people from my island have never even been to the sister neighboring islands because they don't have resources for that. It's all about food on the table, clothes on your back, school supplies, right? And so how do we transition? It's about diversion of funds. As a lawmaker, that is where you're able to control the kind of programs, the type of initiatives that are implemented in a community, right? So if we take funds away from the military, the US military, and we give it to environmental organizations, scientific organizations, and we can invite them into my community to come and help us gather knowledge, gather data. Let's build more scientists. We know very little about the marine mammals and the marine life that is surrounding the Mariana Islands. Just in the past 5 years, they discovered that it is a breeding ground for the humpback whales. And this is a scientific mystery that was discovered just in 2015, right? So if we had more resources like that versus resources that fund wars, that is a transition that I think our community can really rally behind, because that is a transition that will support our people, that will increase quality of life, it will increase education levels, it will really save the natural resources, the beautiful natural resources that we have around us.
So I think the military needs to be transitioned.
Exactly, exactly.
So what would be a just transition for the military? I think the war for the military needs to be the war to fight climate change, not humans. I think that's the transition that I see the military moving towards, because shoring up, making sure that our communities are safe instead of dead, is very, very important. I also see, though, that there are other different entities that play roles here, like the World Trade Organization. We met in Bali, Indonesia, and the World Trade Organization was putting more bases in the Pacific Rim to protect merchandise in globalization and ships and those kinds of things, not people. But they did it under the war on terror, right? That was the auspice of that.
Yeah.
So the future, the way it's going now, the military is going to be protecting lithium, because the oil thing is kind of like, lithium and water. Those two things are going to be protected by the military, and that's where I think things are moving.
This has been such an rich discussion. We are almost out of time, but I am so glad that we have brought into this space these important ideas. We have talked about racism, white supremacy. We have talked about climate capitalism. We have talked about carbon colonialism. And we have talked about our visions for a just transition.
That's right.
And I wonder if we can close with each of our panelists sharing in just a minute what it is that you want to see come out of this COP, or what it is that you are bringing here, or your communities and voices are bringing here. And we'll go in the order that we started. Peyton.
Well, thank you. I agree with everything you said. It's been a wonderful panel. I think it's a bit too late for me to say what I want to get out of this COP, so I'll talk about what I want to get out of the next COP. And I really want to make sure that our communities develop our own Greta Thunbergs, right, so that we can, begin to take the face and the front of these climate crises in which we're hit first and worst. I also want to leave folks with this quote. Now, I hate to be quoting this person, but I won't even say their name. Power is not given, it is taken. And the act of taking power is empowering within itself.
That's right.
My hope, and I agree with Peyton, that I think we have to look to the next COP, but I really want to hear more people-focused discussions. The science is irrefutable. We have been told this is urgent. We are in a climate emergency and crisis. It is time to act. We have discussed carbon markets, which were meant to be a gap measure, never meant to be the leading way of how we reduce emissions. We need to put people back in the discussion and keep the focus on what can we do for the people who are impacted in this. So my hope for the next COP is that we really start talking about workers and communities behind just transition. Let's talk about human rights and protecting people from human rights abuses. And let's give our Indigenous brothers and sisters more of a platform to be leading discussions and hearing their demands, because they have the knowledge to take us forward in a way that's not being fully considered now. So I really want to see more people-focused initiatives going forward.
Thanks, Lisa. Babauta.
And I hope that leaving COP, that communities that are represented here and community folks who are listening to us understand that we can win. There was a struggle in Detroit that 33 years folks were trying to shut down this incinerator. Sometimes we don't know who we need to help us. But once we start getting out there in the street and making a lot of noise about what was going on, it made so much noise that those developers that were selling those overpriced buildings and stuff in Midtown, they couldn't sell them buildings because we had put the word out that this incinerator was stinking up the place and making people sick. And so it got so bad with the gossip that the mayor and all of those folks who act like want no problem with that incinerator had to make the incinerator shut down. So the incinerator shut down a year ago, and we love it. Rise up.
Amen.
Man, thank you so much. This has been such a great panel. Being here at COP for the first time, this is the first time the Northern Marianas has been at a COP. Guahan did represent in Spain, but being in these spaces, I can only just feel so much gratitude for all the allies that I have met, and that the networks and the connections that I'm able to bring home. Because at the end of the day, it really was all about coming to COP, not to try and, influence negotiations, which hopefully one day, right, we will be there. But realistically, it was to come out here, gather resources for me to bring home. It's like when your mom and dad go out to work, right, and they come home. they bring home resources. And to me, that's what it was all about at this COP. And I feel like I'll be able to do that because I've built so many relationships. I've learned so much about the just transition framework and false solutions and net zero. You know, these conversations will continue in my community, and that is a success for me.
So, what have I learned from this? I've learned that the people in power here at the UNFCCC are still not listening to the science, are still not seeing the impacts, and are still pushing these impacts onto further generations. We are literally seeing that happening now. And I think that that's shameful. I think that this COP should really be, and future COPs, should really be about doing something for real.
Thank you all. This has been an incredible panel on race, labor, and climate justice. I have been so honored to moderate, and I hope we take these words and this work and all of the viewers out there into our communities and into the streets and to continue to organize, because we're gonna keep fighting on past this COP, climate justice, until the very end.
That's correct.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, Adrian.
You did a great job.
Yeah.